mingle very readily together. It's easy to see what unites the work of the two writers, their Christianity, their conservatism of outlook in general, and of course their professional background in medieval literature in general. I did start to talk about some of the differences between them yesterday that grew out of this difference of opinion about influence, I suppose is the key term here. I've talked about Tolkien's single-mindedness versus Lewis's experimentalism and openness to trying out new things. We can see in Tolkien's case him devoting essentially the whole of his long creative life to this unified legendarium, as it's now commonly called, this linked cycle of legends of his own invention, and that is there as one huge story underlying almost all his major works of fiction. But the core of that narrative is maybe best represented by the Silmarillion, which was never published in his lifetime and was in fact turned down by his editors. The Silmarillion is Middle-earth without the hobbits, without any comic relief. So it's quite stark. It's sort of like an elvish Iliad. In fact, some critic described it as like a telephone directory in Elvish. There are just so many names. So it's only subsequently become popular among, I suppose, hardcore Tolkienians who want to get really into the mythology, will venture into the Silmarillion. But it's not a readily accessible text in the way that The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings obviously are. And so he was quite right, I think, in regarding much of his work as a private obsession that would never really catch on with the reading public at all. And of course he was proved wrong, as we saw in the last two installments, in quite spectacular fashion by the global success of The Lord of the Rings within a few years of its publication. This does give you an impression of the single-mindedness that I'm talking about, this dedication to a project that was very much a personal passion without a great deal of consideration for whether it would win a wide popularity or not. All right. And in tandem with that, it's notable that Tolkien was a painstaking writer, painstaking to a fault. He drafted and redrafted until he was absolutely satisfied with what he had. And in fact, he even satirizes this habit in a wonderful little text worth looking at. I guess you could call it an autobiographical allegory. It's called Leaf by Niggle. And the eponymous hero Niggle is a painter working on an ambitious landscape, but he's torn between the conflicting desires to render each leaf on the tree in the foreground in as much realistic detail as possible, and at the same time represent this wide prospect of the background landscape stretching away to distant mountains. And obviously that's a very effective image for conveying the nature of Tolkien's massive literary project as well. So he's sending himself up in that little fragment, Leaf by Niggle. Now, Lewis, one can see as almost the polar opposite of Tolkien in this respect. He was a very popular lecturer, a very outgoing, loquacious man, a born communicator, really, and a high-profile public intellectual for much of his career as well. He was possibly best known in his own lifetime for the series of radio broadcasts of Christian apologetics that he produced during the war years, in fact. And he's a highly prolific writer in a wide variety of contexts, styles and genres. He's endlessly inventive, constantly experimenting with new and very disparate ideas. All right. So in contrast to this deeply unified world of Tolkien's fiction with a strong sense of inner consistency, Lewis's is often criticised as a bit of a hodgepodge, throwing all sorts of ill-fitting, ill-considered elements together. And if we take surely his most famous work, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, as an easy example, you can see there, thrown together seemingly without consideration, fauns and dryads from Roman mythology, dwarfs, giants and dragons from European folklore, talking animals from nowhere in particular, you know, as the common tradition in children's writing of the time. You have magical furniture thrown in, of course, the Snow Queen from Anderson's fairy tale, and Father Christmas shows up in the story as well. And it seems as if he's got an anything goes approach. As long as it makes for a good story, it doesn't matter where it comes from. And this annoyed Tolkien. It led to his perception of him being too easily influenced, whereas, as I said yesterday, Lewis had the opposite view of Tolkien, that you couldn't influence him at all. And in fact, there's a lovely quote of Lewis's about Tolkien. He said, "You might as well try to influence a bandersnatch," which was one of the creatures in Jabberwocky. I don't know what makes it particularly uninfluenceable, but it just sounds good. Right. But this impression of Lewis, which has prevailed for a while, has recently been turned on its head. In the last few years, we've been treated to a really remarkable work of criticism by an Oxford academic, Michael Ward. And I'll have much more to say about his research later. But for the time being, I just wanted to start by clarifying this essential difference in temper between Lewis's work from Tolkien's, so that I think we're well advised to ignore the superficial similarities between them and try to assess Lewis's work on its own merits. All right. So during our question time, I think at the introduction on Monday, one of the subjects that came up was children and the suitability of fantasy for children vis-a-vis adults and vice versa, and perhaps both at once. And of course, because Lewis is best known for the Chronicles of Narnia, a question perhaps comes up, why not lecture on those? Why choose the lesser known science fiction novels instead? Is it simply because, you know, I'm lecturing to an adult readership here? Are the Chronicles of Narnia not important? Are they not suitable for adults? I don't take that view at all, particularly after reading Michael Ward. The impression that you have is, as I said of Tolkien, but perhaps more markedly so in the case of Narnia, the stories are quite clearly written for a child audience, but that doesn't mean they're only written for a child audience. It means that they don't exclude children, but the more you look at what happens there, the more you see, again, layers and layers. And in fact, we'll get to this wonderful detail of medieval cosmology that underlies them just as much, if not more so, than the novels we're reading set in various planets that the protagonist Ransom visits. So I will have something to say about the Chronicles of Narnia by the end of the lecture, and in particular Michael Ward's fascinating thesis about them. But I'm going to lead up to that with my remarks on the Ransom novels. All right. So I'd like to begin there with the same question we considered in the case of Lord of the Rings yesterday, how are the real and the unreal or otherworldly aligned with one another in these novels? What type of fantasy is this in terms of those classifications of intrusive, portal, immersive, or liminal fantasies? What type of fantasies are these? And I think if we do this, we start to run into difficulties, just as we did with The Lord of the Rings, but this time for slightly different reasons. All right? If we had to choose one of the 4 labels for these novels, it would probably be portal, at least for the first 2, because we start in this world and then we are carried off with Ransom to other planets, Malacandra and Perelandra, which we only subsequently discover are our Mars and Venus. But then, of course, in that hideous strength, we'd have to then switch to the intrusive classification, because there we remain in the fictional but wholly realistic setting of a small English university town, Bracton College at Edgestowe, and the Institute at Belbury, and the community of St Anne's. It's almost as if we're back in the Shire again. But this lulls us into a false sense of security, which of course is then disrupted by increasingly uncanny goings-on. And ultimately, the climax of that final novel, one of these truly remarkable leaps of imagination that I said are characteristic of Lewis when I introduced each of the 4 as having some special mark of originality about them. What happens in this final novel is, instead of the character going to other planets come to him. And you wonder, now, how is that possible? That, of course, it's because of this treatment of planets as not simply heavenly bodies in the material sense, but as archangelic beings, or in pagan terminology, gods. In fact, that climactic chapter is called The Descent of the Gods. Quite fascinating. So I'll be commenting specifically on that when we get to it. But we mustn't get ahead of ourselves. We must begin with Out of the Silent Planet first. All right. But I want to first just problematize again this question of, do these labels, portal and intrusive fantasy, do justice to what's going on here? And I feel that just as Tolkien presented us with a hypothetically believable reality that is separated from us only by this vast distance of time, all right, so Lewis, choosing a species of science fiction or perhaps science fantasy, is able to suggest that realities very different from our own may nonetheless exist in the very far reaches of space. And I don't think we should be put off, even today, by our much greater knowledge of the real Mars and Venus and the extreme difference between Lewis's vividly imaginative portraits of those planets and what we know about those planets in scientific reality. That's not the point at all here. Lewis doesn't expect us to believe that his accounts of Mars and Venus are factually accurate, any more than Tolkien wants us to believe that his ancient history of the world before known history is a true rather than an invented one. All right, but both of them know they're writing fiction, but both make it relatively plausible. There's nothing in the Ransom novels equivalent to an inexplicable magic wardrobe. All right, we start with Dr. Ransom walking down a country road. It's as understated and ordinary an opening as you could as hope to find anywhere. Of course, the pace quickens very early on, but it starts at a very low level. And interestingly, Ransom, when we first meet him, is called the pedestrian, which is capitalized because he's on a country walking tour, but it sort of exaggerates the ordinariness of the central figure as well. All right. He turns out to be anything but pedestrian in the end. So, although what follows then is increasingly extraordinary, it's still framed as possible. And I think we can imaginably accept that other planets could be like this, all right? So as a result, any easy definition of Out of the Silent Planet as portal fantasy is problemized. There's no point in the story comparable to the back of the wardrobe. There's no point of transition between the real and the other worlds. We have this journey on a spaceship, all right? Just as Middle-earth is supposed to be the real world very long ago, Malacandra and Perelandra are imaginary other planets, but they're supposed to be Mars and Venus in our own real-world solar system. So again, there are bridges linking the believable and the highly imaginative. All right. As I promised you on Monday, real consideration of these three novels has to do with Lewis's genre-bending, all right? This is in relation to the example of a story about talking animals turning into an alternative account of the Gospels, all right? Something totally unexpected. You can see a similar thing happening even in the first novel, Out of the Silent Planet, that you're starting out with space travel a la H.G. Wells, and you're ending up in territory more easily associated with Dante in the Paradiso. All right. So again, we have moved within a couple of hundred pages from sort of two radically different literary paradigms. All right. And we don't necessarily realize that's happening while we're enjoying the story. The surprises start very early on, but the first ones don't even hint at how far things are going to go. The first clue is that our protagonist is not, as normally the case in H.G. Wells, the scientist who builds the spaceship and goes on a great adventure of discovery. Instead, that character is the antagonist, the villain, Professor Weston. He's the baddie in this story. The protagonist is a Cambridge philologist, like his friend Tolkien, the Oxford philologist. All right? I'm not suggesting he's a portrait of Tolkien in any real sense at all. But the fact that he is a philologist plays an important role in the story because he is able to acquire these extraterrestrial languages much more easily than most of us would. So that turns out to be fortuitous and seemingly predestined as well. All right. There he is, minding his own business. He stumbles on the mad scientist at work, apparently a complete fluke, a coincidence, and is kidnapped by him unexpectedly, and of course his even slimier accomplice, Divine, very ironic name. Of course it's spelt wrong, that's a little clue as well. And he's taken with them for what ultimately turns out to be a huge misunderstanding. They think the aliens want a human sacrifice, and they're ready to take one of their fellow men and let him have the chop so that they can make themselves rich and famous by plundering the planet's resources. But the next stage of the increasing surprises, so far, I mean, it's going from a walk down a country road to a very exciting thriller. There's nothing obviously supernatural as yet. That comes later, right? But there are these subtle hints of what's to come in the journey to Malacandra. Ransom and the reader don't know yet that it is Mars. He's got no idea where he's going or what they're planning to do with him, but he has the beginnings of this ecstatic experience against all odds, and this sense that what he calls the cold vacuity of space is a modern myth, that he's in this realm of endless light. So already he has a conception of something heavenly, and Weston, when he briefly discusses it, offers plausible materialist explanations for what is causing this. For example, the fact that they're no longer in the Earth's shadow, they are exposed to direct sunlight all the time. But there are hints in the narrative that doesn't really account for what's going on, that there is a spiritual experience underway as well, and that Ransom is opening up to some other influences, and he becomes braver as he gets closer to Mars. Mars, of course, is the god of war. It's making him courageous, but this is very subtly introduced into the story at first. Later, among the Hrossa, he becomes a warrior and a Hnakra slayer. That's a kind of fulfillment of the warrior role that he unexpectedly finds himself in. All right. And of course, once he reaches the planet, despite his fears of what he's going to encounter there, he's struck by how unaccountably beautiful it is. All right? And Lewis devotes great narrative skill to describing this completely unfamiliar reality, but making it feel so beautiful that the reader almost wishes that you could visit Malacandra yourself. But the surprises continue. What do we expect him to meet? What does Ransom expect to meet? I think the last thing any of us expect is this sort of giant Ottoman, the Hross. It's very surprising. It's quite unlike any other writer's treatment of the alien that I can think of. But I feel there's a sort of foreshadowing of what we get in Narnia as well, that he wants to have something like a talking animal that is human but not human. And this concept of the hnao, the rational being, that is not necessarily limited to the human alone. It's broadening his consciousness. It's allowing him to see a kind of humanity in the non-human, almost. Yeah. All right. Can't read my own handwriting here. The next surprise, of course, is that after all this initial excitement, the narrative then slows down, goes in an unusual direction. For a while, nothing happens. After he manages to escape from his captors, Ransom simply lives among the Hrossa for what I think is a period of some months. And of course, he usefully gets to learn the language and their customs, and he goes hunting with them. And all of this is very lovingly described and very well conveyed in the narrative. But it's quite surprising. We didn't expect this. He's been kidnapped, he's sort of escaped, and now here he is living among these otter people on this wonderfully colourful planet, where everything is extraordinarily vertical as well. And there's a double meaning in that as well. It's implied the scientific explanation for that is because the gravity is lower, so it makes sense that everything would be able to grow taller, so that you have these wonderfully slender tree-like plants that seem almost to sway like seaweed does underwater. I think it's like a kelp forest, but in the open air, and these mountains that are impossibly tall, and all the creatures that he meets are too tall for their height. He sees. But there's another entirely symbolic reason as well. He's using phallic imagery, all right? I don't think Lewis is particularly influenced by or interested in Freud, but the phallus, since ancient times, has connoted maleness, and of course Mars is the archetypally male planet. So there is a kind of poetic symbolism in encoding that into the landscape, just as when we get to Perelandra, or Venus, everything is feminized. In fact, Ransom's arrival on Perelandra is described very much in terms of a birth. In fact, a rebirth, because he's sent there in a sort of coffin-shaped box, and it dissolves, and he's in this sort of womb-like ocean, and then he emerges into this paradise. And of course, the first person he meets and has much communication with is the Green Lady, an image of fertility. Very much like all those extravagant fruits that surround him in that paradisal world. So Lewis in both novels is drawing on centuries-old gender symbolism very effectively. Right. Now I have to find my place. I get carried away, and then I've started adding more arrows to remind me where I left off. Here we are. What's starting to happen throughout this process, and it becomes clearer by the climax of the first novel, when he finally meets this being, the Oyarsa, that he thought up to that point was possibly just an invented being, that the Throssa have some kind of primitive religion. It turns out in the Malacandrian context, Ransom is the primitive one who has to learn what's really going on. But what is happening is that the whole modern materialist worldview of space as merely empty is being exploded and turned inside out. And this is partly an expression of religious faith and partly wish fulfillment. But at the heart of the matter there lies Lewis's deep love and professional knowledge of ancient and medieval astrology. All right, which is much, much more than just horoscopes. All right. It's what is illustrated by this wonderful model of the Ptolemaic universe, a geocentric model, long before Copernicus came along and proved that, in fact, the Earth and all the other planets revolve around the Sun. The Earth was imagined as the center of the cosmos, and all the other planets and the Sun as well revolving around it. All right. And all of the planets were supposed to have particular characters. All right. Lewis knew and admired the well-known orchestral composition by Gustav Holst, The Planet Suite, where you can listen in orchestral form to the characters of the planets being expressed there. Mars sounds terrifying and warlike, and Jupiter sounds noble and regal because he is the king of the gods, the kingly planet. And Lewis was fascinated by this similar sense of the planet's personalities, so to speak. All right, so he is drawing on a very rich knowledge of this, and it crops up everywhere in his work, both his fiction and his scholarly work, including an academic work called The Discarded Image, because it's about how this image of the cosmos has been discarded. It has been replaced by the familiar post-Newtonian one. And Lewis thought that was a pity. All right. He does admit quite reluctantly towards the end of his discussion of this view of the cosmos and the planets, that it has one disadvantage. He says, unfortunately, it wasn't true. Yeah. But he still clearly finds it imaginatively superior to what has replaced it. And he says that the planets continue to have great value to us as spiritual symbols. All right. So, hence in his fiction, where he has room to be more creative, he actually does the opposite. He turns the tables. He makes it seem as if the post-Newtonian model is the one that isn't true. Because that is what Ransom has assumed to be true, what Weston arrogantly knows is absolutely true, and yet in the course of the narrative is shown to be not true at all, and it's replaced by something very like the older model, in which the planets were not simply moving through space by the force of gravity. They were set almost as stones within rings. The planets were set in these vast crystalline spheres that were imagined forming concentric circles around one another, and they were turned by the agency of these archangelic beings, and as they turned, they produced the music of the spheres, which is like the angelic choirs singing in perpetual worship of God who lay beyond them. So Lewis just loved this visionary sense of the planetary spheres, which is everywhere in the literature he loved. It's everywhere in Shakespeare and Spenser and Milton. All these great figures are drawing on this old world view, and Lewis wants to take us back to it as well. All right. And so it turns out, in the end of that first novel, that Mars is not just a planet, but an archangel or a god, and Ransom has a conversation with him. Again, there's nothing else quite like it anywhere in Wellesian science fiction, certainly. Lewis is taking that genre and turning it on its head. All right. And of course it's Earth that turns out to be the silent planet, because it's Earth that has fallen, and it is Earth's guiding intelligence, it's implied, is the devil. So that our planet is the one that is out of tune with the music of the spheres. All right. And no longer part of this divine cosmic order. All right. This then prepares the way for the next two installments. All right. And the first of those, Perelandra, sums up very quickly, in a nutshell. Lewis introduces himself briefly as the narrator, and he sums up very neatly what was an undisclosed mystery throughout most of the first novel, which is that the supernatural exists in two categories. He says we have fairy tales about ghosts and goblins and the religious perhaps as well, and then we have theories about aliens on other planets. And so, well, these two categories we don't normally think of combining, but he's asking the question: what if they were in fact the same thing? I think it's a bit like the questions that people like Erich von Däniken ask, only in reverse. You know, instead of wondering what if the gods of old mythologies were really aliens, Lewis is asking what if aliens were really the gods of old mythology. All right, it's a subtle but crucial distinction. All right, he's emphasizing that the earlier reality was the true one. So as Perelandra progresses, as I've already said, we have this rich evocation of the paradisal planet, and this, of course, then provides a setting for a very exciting supernatural thriller. And you certainly experience, I think, a horrible thrill of recognition as Ransom starts to discover that he's found himself in a repeat of Genesis chapter 2. With the Unman taking the role of the serpent tempting Eve, only this time someone else is there, and that's Ransom himself, and he's got to do something about it to stop a second fall taking place. So it becomes a very exciting piece of storytelling in its own right. Meanwhile, of course, we have this terrifying transition of Western into the Unman. It's important not to criticize, to confuse the two. There's something Faustian going on here, isn't there? The scientist, Western, has become obsessed with the importance of his own project. He's been a thoroughgoing materialist up to this point, but he's discovered that what he calls the macrobes, so he's using a scientific term, retaining that original worldview, but what he's describing are these creatures on a larger scale than us. But of course the ones that Western has been in contact with are the fallen or bent ones. And of course, as he says, I open myself up to that power, he is unwittingly making a sort of Faustian compact with the devil. And the point when Ransom sees him again, he is in Western's body, but clearly no longer Western, hence calling him the Unman, this terrible sort of zombie-like creature, but far worse than that, something that speaks with Western's voice, but is clearly exhibiting diabolical intelligence. So a terrifying story at many points as well. Right. But of course, Ransom does step up, and we have a happy outcome, and beyond that, really enter Dantean territory now, this visionary, transcendental finale where they're having a sort of, they're all communing together in a beatific vision. So Perelandra ends on a particularly high note. But then as we move on to the final novel, That Hideous Strength, we come back down to earth with a bump. The final novel is strangely anticlimactic, at least at first, as we go from these visionary journeys to Mars and Venus to, as I said, this little sleepy English university town, but all sorts of odd goings-on are there. Critics agree that Lewis tries to pull off a bit too much in this novel. It's another very odd mixture of things. We have a story of a dysfunctional marriage. We have a kind of Orwellian satire of fascism. We have the myth of Babel occurring in this story of Belbury, this tower, this institute trying to achieve godly power through blasphemous means. We have Merlin coming into the story out of the remote British past, and we have the return of the planets at the climax. All right, so there's maybe too much being squeezed into one novel in this case, but certainly that climactic arrival of the planets makes a strong impression, and it's an attempt at least to tie together the various cosmic personalities plus a few more in a way that reveals more of Lewis's obsession with the cosmological. And it confirms that earlier premise I mentioned, that he regarded the planets as primarily spiritual symbols. All right. If you remember in this episode, in The Descent of the Gods, Mars and Venus are both there. They're sort of descending invisibly into the house at St. Anne's, but how they're registered is not visibly, but the human characters who are present, both upstairs and downstairs, feel the change within them, within their consciousness, within their emotions. They feel the influence of those planets directly. So just as we saw hinted at with Ransom getting braver when he first went to Mars, so when Mars arrives, everyone in the house feels braver and perhaps capable of dying if necessary in defense of his and her friends. Venus, we also know already, when she arrives, everybody feels more loving to one another. All right, but we have 3 more of the planetary gods arriving in that chapter as well. That we haven't needed to go to their planets to visit them. They simply come along for the ride with Mars and Venus, and they arrive. So we have Mercury, I think, is the first to arrive, because, of course, he is the herald of the gods, the messenger, the lord of language. And when he arrives, suddenly everyone has this heightened ability to talk quickly and to have ideas and to make puns and to be very clever. And then Saturn arrives, the god of old age and time, and they feel this terrible weight of the centuries on their shoulders as Saturn arrives. All right, but presiding over all the others, you also have Jupiter, the king, who makes them all feel very regal and splendid, and they get up and do a solemn dance to celebrate his arrival. It's all very odd, but it's conveyed in heightened prose that is very effective. Right? Jupiter plays the climactic role. One of the functions of Jupiter as priest king is to preside over marriages. And of course the marriage of Mark and Jane is not fully healed in the course of the narrative, but it ends at the point where it seems it's about to. And Mars and Venus, the presiding deities of the first 2 novels, are brought together. The first word of that hideous strength is matrimony. And they're brought together. And Ransom himself, by this time, has retreated a little bit off stage and become a kingly figure in his own right. He's now Mr. Fisher King, the figure of the Pendragon. And he, in a sense, presides over bringing their marriage together as if he is Jupiter's representative on Earth now. Very interesting what Lewis is up to. But it isn't quite as successful as he wants it to be. And in much of what I've been saying in the last 10 minutes at least, is already drawing on the work of Michael Ward that I mentioned at the beginning. And now this is the time to bring that in and try and sum it up in a nutshell, and then we can open for questions as usual. Ward's discovery is the envy of anyone working in the field. It hardly ever happens that someone makes as fortuitous a discovery as he had. It's a genuinely groundbreaking reading of Lewis that changes the way that we read him now. What is it? You first have to admit that it sounds a bit dubious. All right? He calls it the Narnia Code. And he admits that it sounds horribly like the Da Vinci Code and totally suspect. But the opposite proves to be the case. As you go on to read him, and he has a documentary on the Narnia Code, and there's a website you can visit, and then the full-length academic study that he's written, but it's very readable, is called Planet Narnia, The 7 Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis. And he lays out the evidence as successfully as an expert barrister, and he convinces you by the sheer accumulation of detail that it must be right, because there is too much for it to be coincidental. So what is it? He's saying that Lewis exhibited this fascination with the planets throughout his writings, all right? And he says the upshot is that the Chronicles of Narnia are actually the final and the most complete treatment of the cosmic theme in Lewis's writing. And your immediate response would surely be, how can that be when he's moved from science fiction, where he can obviously deal with the planets directly, to children's fairy tales? Where are the planets here? Well, the answer turns out to be everywhere. And this is because, for Lewis, the planets aren't merely planets, but spiritual symbols. So we no longer need to represent them literally at all, what happens is that the character of each one, and he argues that each of the 7 chronicles is modelled on one of the 7 planets, right? So the character of each is coded into each designated story, and it's everywhere. It's in the nature of the plot itself, it's in the atmosphere, it's in the images, the details, and it's especially concentrated in the Christ figure, Aslan, and the way that he operates in each story. And so very briefly, his examples, Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, he says, is governed by Jupiter, because here everything is kingly. Aslan is introduced as the king of the wood, and he's referred to as the king several times, and his behaviour is particularly kingly, and he makes the ultimate sacrifice, which is the function of the priest-king. It takes place on the altar. The children themselves become kings. The central point of that story, the transition from winter to summer, is an image that Lewis had associated with the influence of Jupiter throughout his writing, long before that story appeared. And it's a sign of Jupiter working, as in Holst's musical suite, as the bringer of joy. So that's an extremely brief summary. If you look up Michael Ward's work, he'll give you much more detail. But he has the same thing. He sees Mars governing Prince Caspian, and you can in fact see similarities between that story and Out of the Silent Planet. The perpendicularity of those tall plants. Well, Prince Caspian is full of trees that come to life in the end, like Tolkien's Ents, and go marching to war. He says that Venus governs the magician's nephew, which is very much about Diggory's relationship with his mother, who is dying, but she's healed in the end by the magic apple from the gardens of the West. So the imagery of fertility and healing and the maternal is all worked into that story. All right. Mercury and Saturn are there as well. Mercury is in the Horse and His Boy, which is often about story and talking. And it begins when a horse unexpectedly talks. All right. The last battle is governed by Saturn, because it's the end of all things. So it's appropriately saturnine and solemn. All right. But there are 2 missing, aren't there? That's only 5 planets. Where are the other 2? Well, they're not Uranus and Neptune, because they weren't discovered until the invention of the telescope. So they're not part of the medieval model at all. So they don't count. So what are the other 2 then? Well, you have to remember we are in a geocentric universe. So the other 2 planets are not what we think of as planets at all. They are Luna and Sol, the moon and the sun. In fact, you can make out on this diagram, here's the Earth at the centre, and there is the sun as one of the other planets revolving in orbit around it. Scientifically quite inaccurate, but wonderfully imaginative. And Sol, as the title suggests, governs the voyage of the Dawn Treader. It's a voyage to the east, to the rising sun itself. And as they approach the sun, the light grows brighter and brighter. And then the silver chair, he says, is governed by Luna. Silver was believed to be the moon's metal. And that story is full of doubt and accidents and mistakes and confusion and uncertainty, because, of course, the moon is traditionally associated with wondering and with wandering wits and lunacy, and all that is encoded into that story as well. So it checks out on every level. Tomorrow, of course, we move in a whole new direction, looking at T.H. White's sequence, The Once and Future King. But meanwhile, I have gone on a bit over time as usual, but we still have space for as many questions as you can fit in. I'll just refresh quickly. And, go ahead.
At the end of Perelandra, what do you make of the Vital Ransom's
The bite on Ransom's heel. Yes, I think he gets that heel from the Unman, doesn't he, in their battle. Well, I think the first thing that you notice is that it's another echo of Genesis. You know, the serpent shall bite your heel. So there's a biblical allusion worked into that. Yeah, is endlessly clever here. But that stays with him, and then if you remember when we meet Ransom again in quite a long way into that hideous strength. Well, when you get to that, he is still wounded. I mean, you think it's just a bite in the heel. It's nasty, but surely it would heal. And it never does heal. And he's Mr. Fisher King. So there's those Arthurian resonances are brought together in that as well. So it's part of his new role in the final story is that he's this presiding priest-king figure, and he is like, I think it's King Peleus in Mallory, the Fisher King, who is wounded not in the heel, that comes from Genesis. He's usually wounded in the side or the thigh, like Christ on the cross. So he is this maimed, stricken figure. And it's all sorts of things. It is symbolically very rich and multi-layered, but one of the things it's doing is it's operating as a sort of penance. It's making him like King Arthur, you know, who has to, because he is the Pendragon as well, who has to be taken away to Avalon at the end of his life to be healed of his grievous wound. And we see Lewis brings that into the story as well, that Ransom is allowed to go back to Venus, that becomes Avalon for him. So there's so much going on. As I said, that hideous strength almost seems to combine too much into it. It's perhaps not ideally successful. Ward's argument is that Lewis finally accomplishes what he wants to do with planetary symbolism in the Chronicles of Narnia only. But even if it is in some senses a failure, it's a fascinating failure and still well worth reading and rereading. So yes, that wound in the heel is something. It never stops bleeding. Throughout that hideous strength, Ransom only ever appears lying down on his couch. And he has to be treated by his doctor every day. So he's sort of moved off stage a bit. It's a little bit of an anticlimax as well, because he's been our central figure all along, and now he's just he's the sort of chairman of the board, but it's all the other people that act, that are the main players in that story. Other questions? Unusually quiet today. Oh, you haven't done your homework, yeah? Yeah. Well, I hope what we've talked about will encourage you to carry on. These are immensely readable stories. But I'm glad I was able to bring Narnia into it as well, because you can go back and read those seemingly innocent stories and see so much more that was never there before. And I can't recommend Michael Ward's work highly enough. If you just Google Planet Narnia, it will take you to his website. Well, that's it then. I'll see you again tomorrow. Thank you.